In August of 1937, a young man named Jack Walls fled Campbell County after escaping from jail where he was being held on minor charges. In September that same year, he approached a police officer on the street in Louisville, Kentucky. He told the officer he had killed a man in Tennessee in December of 1932, nearly 5 years before. He confessed to police that he had gotten into an argument with a man named Frank Romance Romine one night in Vasper when both had been drinking. It was said the argument was over liquor money Romine had been given by Walls. He told police he had hit Romine over the head with a club, knocking him unconscious. He then dragged Romine onto the railroad track and left him. Romine's mangled body was indeed found the next day. It was assumed at the time the death was accidental. Campbell County deputies traveled to Louisville and took 22-year-old Walls into custody after his spontaneous confession to the officer. In October of 1937, the grand jury indicted Jack Walls. The same day, he was allowed to plead guilty to voluntary manslaughter and was sentenced to serve 2 to 10 years in the Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary. Walls didn't see even 2 years behind bars. He was out in 17 months and living in LaFollette by 1940. He was also, by that time, dating a local lady, Maggie Adams, who lived with her mother, Nanny Adams. Maggie and her mother lived in the rock quarry on North Indiana Avenue. Early in 1940, Nanny Adams took ill. She was diagnosed with pneumonia. There was no LaFollette hospital at this time. Therefore, Nanny tried to ride out the illness at home. She didn't make it. Nanny passed away on March 8th of 1940, and her death was ruled to be from pneumonia. At some point in or around November of 1940, Maggie Adams and Jack Walls had moved to Indiana. Now, by late November or early December of 1940, a woman calling herself Muriel McCoy entered a roadhouse in Seymour, Indiana, and began speaking of a horrible crime to restaurant patrons. They called the sheriff, who began questioning the woman. She told the sheriff that she and her boyfriend, Jack Walls, had poisoned her mother back in LaFollette, Tennessee. She told the sheriff the pair had put lye in the mother's drinks, poisoning her to death, in order to collect her $26 a month pension for themselves. She stated, "We did it for the insurance. I collected $26 per month for 7 months until I left the state. I suppose I'm cut off from the pension now. I helped Jack in the poisoning of her. We put lye in her whiskey and coffee. She died in 48 hours. We administered the fatal dose at night. She was unconscious for the last 24 hours of her life." Dr. J.P. Lindsay, who had signed off on the pneumonia death, admitted he hadn't seen Adams in the final 48 hours of her life, only that he had seen her sometime before that period, and she was very ill. Dr. Lindsay stated, "I would have known, of course, if she had been given lye if it had happened before I'd seen her. She was a charity case. I don't keep records of those visits. I left her some medicine. Some days later, I was told she died." This wasn't the last bombshell admission, far from it. Some several weeks earlier, in early November of 1940, the badly damaged body of 25-year-old Clyde Hatmaker was found beside the railroad tracks in Campbell County. His body was described as mangled. His head was crushed and one arm was severed from his torso. It was found by the coroner's jury that he was ran over by the L&N northbound train near Chester in Campbell County, Tennessee. While she was in jail in Brownsville, Indiana, Adams stated in a letter that Walls had killed Hatmaker and placed his body on the tracks to make it look like he was run over by a train. This letter was ostensibly sent to Walls himself, but was received and opened by another man with whom Walls had been living in Columbus, Indiana. This was, of course, the very crime Walls had committed in 1932 and gotten away with for 5 years, until he confessed. The man sent the letter to Sheriff Lay in Campbell County, who contacted authorities in Indiana. He then went to Indiana with 3 deputies to collect Adams. The letter in part read, "I am drunk as I can be. Say, old pal, how did you get along with the whiskey you got for killing Clyde Hatmaker? Now, who killed my mother for that little check? You know we did, so please take it like a man and tell the truth." Walls was also detained in Indiana shortly after. He denied killing Hatmaker and Adams, but was sent back to Campbell County to face charges for his role in the poisoning of Nanny Adams and also for the murder of Clyde Hatmaker. When asked why Adams would say he was guilty, Walls stated, "She's mad at me because I won't lay up with her any longer. I had nothing to do with the death of Hatmaker or her mother." When he questioned Adams, Sheriff Clifford Lay asked her why she would confess to such a crime knowing it was an offense for which she may very well be hanged. Her reply was, "Perhaps I wanted to die." When informed that speculation around town was that her mother's teeth had suddenly fallen out in the last 2 days of her life, it said that she hooted with laughter, but denied they had, saying her mother had lost her teeth over a number of years. She said the dentist would confirm that. There was much debate about exhuming the body of Nanny Adams from Ivydale Cemetery and testing it for lye poisoning. In what seems a very odd turn by modern standards, it was determined by the county that they couldn't afford it initially. The cost was to be $100, and the county only budgeted $50 a year for inquests of that type that this would fall under. It was determined that 31 of those dollars had been spent, leaving only $19. It was proposed by then Attorney General Howard Baker Sr. that the autopsy was a must. He stated, "An autopsy must be held in a case as important as this. I wrote Sheriff Lay that the case could not travel unless the corpus delicti could be proved, and an analysis of the contents of the stomach is the only way in sight." General Baker went on to suggest that the money for the exhumation and autopsy that was over the 19 remaining dollars be borrowed on promise of repayment in the next year's budget. Baker suggests using a Dr. Ralph Mongar from Knoxville, who had been hired by the Attorney General in a prior case and had only charged $25 to examine stomach contents. Baker was certain Mongar would work on credit. Sheriff Lay, acting on the direction of General Baker, was able to secure credit for the exhumation and autopsy. After all the hoops were jumped through, Maggie Adams admitted she had lied about the poisoning of her mother because she was upset with Jack Walls. However, she continued to insist that Walls had killed Clyde Hatmaker. Thus, it was decided to not yet perform the autopsy. The tale wove about the death of Hatmaker was far more convoluted and brought in multiple additional conspirators. The sheriff would elaborate on the whiskey Adams referred to in her letter to Walls. Sheriff Lay had found a witness from just over the Jellicoe border that named Walls in the Hatmaker killing, but also named a Noah Riggs and a Susan Martin, both of whom were arrested as conspirators with Walls, whom it was alleged did the actual killing. The state contended that Susan Martin sought revenge in the death of her son, an unsolved murder from 1936. Martin, the state argued, was convinced Clyde Hatmaker killed the young man. This story came from Dolly Goins, who told investigators that she overheard the conversation in which Martin offered Walls 5 gallons of whiskey to polish off Hatmaker. Goins herself decided she didn't want to come to Campbell County to testify and missed 2 preliminary hearings to which she had been subpoenaed. This prompted a warrant for her arrest to be issued. At this point, the case has 4 dead bodies: Frank Romine, Nanny Adams, Clyde Hatmaker, and Martin's son. It has 4 arrests: Walls, Adams, Riggs, and Martin, with a warrant issued for Goins. The following was the pretrial statement given Sheriff Lay from Maggie Adams on December 5, 1940, from just before she had changed her story about killing her mother. It reads, The reason I am giving this statement is that Jack Walls has tried to kill me several times since he came back from the penitentiary at Brushy Mountain, and I know so much on him, I am afraid he will kill me. In addition to other things I know he has done, he knows I know of the poisoning of my mother in which he took part, and this has been on my mind so much, I decided to change my way of living. He has planned these things out, and I admit I was with him, but I have changed, and I want this off my mind. Dolly Goins, having missed multiple procedural court dates, claimed fear for her safety as the reason she hadn't attended prior preliminary hearings. Sheriff Lay finally convinced her to come to a hearing. In exchange, he'd request the warrant be dropped and promise her safe travel through Campbell County. With preliminary evidence from the sheriff, presented to Justice of the Peace John M. McLeod, Adams, Walls, Riggs, and Martin were bound over to the grand jury and ordered held on $2,500 bond. Even though she'd recanted and there was no autopsy, Adams and Walls were charged with killing Nanny Adams as well as Clyde Hatmaker due to Sheriff Lay presenting Adams' statement reflecting the lye poisoning. Riggs and Martin were only charged in the Hatmaker death. Each defendant pleaded not guilty. At the grand jury trial of Walls, Sheriff Lay himself acted as prosecutor for the state, introducing evidence and questioning witnesses. Sheriff Lay laid forth the key piece of evidence against Walls and the other alleged conspirators. Dolly Goins, who was notoriously unreliable regarding court dates, had made a sworn affidavit that Walls and Adams invited her to go along with them to the home of Noah Riggs, who lived just across the Kentucky border in Whitley County. The trio, she said, had traveled there to obtain moonshine whiskey from Riggs and Susie Martin. Then discussion of the murder had taken place. Walls' attorney, Boyce Griffith, objected to this evidence, saying Walls couldn't be denied the right to cross-examine witnesses again. Maggie Adams took the stand. She told the court that Jack Walls and Susie Martin became increasingly drunk during the evening. She said Martin began getting emotional and crying over the unsolved murder of her son, Osby Martin. She testified that Martin blamed Clyde Hatmaker for the death. Jack Walls allegedly told Martin that to get rid of someone and get away with it, you had to put their body on the railroad tracks. Adams testified that Walls told her that he would knock him off for her. "I'll knock him off for you. Give me 5 gallons of liquor and I'll do it," was the statement Adams attributed directly to Walls. On cross-examination, attorney Griffith sparred with Adams. He asked her how she knew Walls killed Hatmaker. Adams said she was in jail when the alleged murder took place over financial crimes, but that after being released, Walls had admitted to killing Hatmaker. She was asked what time they arrived at the home of Riggs and Martin. She said she didn't know the time because she had no timepiece. For this same reason, she said she had no idea how long they stayed at the house. Griffith asked her how they were seated. She first said all had chairs, but then changed her statement and said she had been seated in Dolly Goins' lap. Adams told Griffith that Susie Martin stated, "If I were a man, I'd kill Clyde Hatmaker myself." She then testified that a price of 5 gallons of liquor was the price for Walls to kill Hatmaker. The testimony of Adams promoted an outburst from Susie Martin in the gallery. Martin had to be threatened with contempt by the judge before she calmed herself enough for the hearing to continue. The sheriff was then allowed to introduce the statement from Dolly Goins into evidence. It read as follows: "I live on the Kentucky side near Jellicoe, Tennessee. I am acquainted with Jack Walls and Maggie Adams. On the night of October 9th, 1940, I was with them when we all three traveled to the home of Noah Riggs up Kentucky Hollow, about 5 miles from LaFollette. We left LaFollette after dark that night and went to Noah Riggs' home so Jack Walls could buy whiskey from Riggs. Riggs sold Walls whiskey but wanted to keep some back for Miss Martin to drink, claiming she had a toothache. We all drank some of the whiskey, but Jack Walls began getting drunk. Riggs and Martin were drinking too. Maggie and I drank little because we knew Jack was going to get drunk and would need looking after. While we were there, Miss Riggs brought out a picture of her son who had been killed some time ago. She began crying as she spoke, and at first, we thought she was accusing Noah Riggs of killing her son. But I found out in a short time she thought Clyde Hatmaker had killed her son. She had a .45 pistol on her bedpost and got it. She then mentioned she wanted to see Clyde Hatmaker killed with that gun. Jack Walls then said how he'd killed Hatmaker for some type of pay. They said something about giving him 5 gallons of whiskey and some money if he killed Hatmaker, but I don't know what amount it might have been. Jack said he'd kill Hatmaker, and they told him to go and do it and come back and settle up. We came back to LaFollette that night and then went on to Harlan and stayed all night, and I left there the next day and came back home around Corbin. They came back later, and Maggie was in jail in Jacksboro next time I saw her. When I saw her there, she asked me if I remembered the conversation between Mr. Riggs, Miss Martin, and Jack Walls about Walls killing Clyde Hatmaker. I did recall that conversation, and she told me that Jack had killed Hatmaker, and she was going to tell it. The grand jury threw out the charges of murder regarding the lye poisoning of Nanny Adams. With no autopsy and the recanted statement, plus Walls' denial, the state had no case. Adams' charge in the death of Clyde Hatmaker was dropped owing to her cooperation in the case and the fact that she was jailed when the death took place. The trial itself saw much of the same evidence the grand jury heard. It wound down with Defense Attorney Griffith and Sheriff Lay making their final pleas to the jury. In the end, not enough people believed in Dolly Goins or Maggie Adams, due in part to what was seen as their immoral lifestyle, having frequently themselves been jailed, and Maggie Adams changing stories in the case. The trial ended in a hung jury. From our research, none of the 3 defendants were ever found guilty of Hatmaker's murder, nor was it ever proven he was murdered. We know only that his death was eerily similar to the death of Frank Romine, and that Jack Walls had indeed killed him and gone on the run for several years before confessing. Whether Jack Walls was a murderer who used train tracks in a gruesome way to hide his crimes on more than one occasion, we will simply never know. The motives and twists in this story only leave us with more questions in the end. And that's how history recorded itself in our Lawless LaFollette. I'm Jennifer Fields for the Volunteer Time series. Thank you for watching.